All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to give it 2 minutes. We'll start just a minute after the top of the hour. For those of you who have participated or joined one of these discussions in the past, it is truly intended as a discussion. Your profiles when you come in are set to mute, but all you have to do is raise your hand and I'll unmute you. The muting is more of a courtesy, so there's not a lot of background noise. We have a bunch of slides today. I'm going to put up a poll. It's not required, but I thought it'd be interesting. And I really look forward to talking about this. There's an awful lot going on right now. All right. 1 o'clock, 1:01, as promised, we're going to get started. There are a lot of slides, and I want to preface this presentation by saying there are a lot of different people on here. From some are highly skilled at understanding refrigerant and have spent their whole careers in it, and you're just here maybe to hear, something that novel or just share in the conversation. And I appreciate that. Others of you may be new to the topic, or you may have a peripheral view of changing aspects, and you want a little bit more information. There are more slides here than would be suitable or needed for any one group specifically. But for the broader group, I thought there were some contextual slides that would help put some perspective on exactly why we're here. So stop me along the way. This is not my goal is not to host an event where I just share what we've learned or what's evolving, but really open up a discussion, because prior to these and post these webinars, it's all about having calls and talking through what's actually happening and how these changes are affecting people. And it's many, many perspectives on the way things are changing and how they affect business as usual. So we're going to jump right in. You're probably all familiar with the fact that refrigerants are atmospheric pollutants. And because of the business as usual approach over the last 30 years, there are a labyrinth of regulatory requirements that are driving change for the next phase of what we do together. These are the 16 that I picked out. There are a couple of others, but they haven't fully evolved. Not all of these have fully evolved either, but we're going to go quickly through many of these. And I look forward to hearing some feedback, and hopefully we make the best use of the next 30 to 45 minutes of your day. All right. If you're wondering why this is such an important issue, because there's 12.5 billion pounds of refrigerant that have been vented since 1994 here in the US. That's a rough estimate based on production numbers, with the full fact that all refrigerants produced, other than a very small cross-section of carbon offset related destruction projects, are destroyed. So most of that gas is ultimately, even if it's recycled, which only about 2 to 3% of all gas is sent back through a reclaimer, that gas is ultimately vented as well. So all of the material that's been produced and shipped to the US, other than some stockpiles, have been vented. And for those of you who are not familiar with why this is happening, keep in mind that the last R11 chillers were sold in the mid-90s, and there are still 11,000 of those R11 chillers in service today. So we started with about 85,000. So if you look at the numbers, we're still at about 15% of our capacity is installed, and that's because there's a long depreciation life on these appliances. So if you look forward and you say, okay, we're in 2023, what does it look like by 2053? It'll give you some perspective on why some of these things might not seem urgent, but they're important. All right, so as a refresher, somebody asked me to share this slide a few weeks ago. So someone in the industry who's important, and I mean important, they help contribute to the ideas that we develop here. It's important to note that right now, all the refrigerants you buy are supposed to be bought by a 608 certified technician. We have something here we're referring to as the 2 to 50 pound rule. Anything 2 to 50 pounds, the expectation is that you're recording the end of life, documenting that, and you have those records. And I want to make sure that everyone understands there's a big difference between record keeping and reporting. The EPA makes the assumption that we're self-policing, self-governing these responsibilities. It only becomes an issue when there's an open investigation. And later on in this discussion, I will share 3 open investigation summaries, things that we're aware of that are happening in the market. Lastly, anybody who says, hey, I send it to my vendor, I'm under the 2-pound rule, I want you to pay close attention to the fact that you still have responsibility for these appliances at the end of their life. And although you may hand it over to a certified company to handle the recovery or extraction of the refrigerant, that company is then responsible for what happens. And in 2021, I want to get this right, the EPA's largest fines and violations were against scrap metal companies that improperly handled refrigerants at the end of their life. And lastly, it's really important to note, all used refrigerant must be reclaimed and returned to an industry purity standard similar to virgin. It's exactly the same as virgin. And it's really important to note that only about 2 to 3% of all refrigerants make their way back at the end of life. We're not here to specifically talk about it today, but following the IPCC's guidelines, which need to be updated slightly, the expectation is that about 70% of that refrigerant should make its way back to reclaim, and it's not. So anyways, starter discussion, but some really powerful things to come. The Clean Air Act is going to go through some revisions in 2024. There'll be certain companies will have the responsibility of reporting into a government portal. The expectation by EPA is that we're going to improve the data quality. The EPA is right now, for anybody who's participating in one of these programs under greenhouse gas reporting protocol, is already familiar with the EPA's effort to establish confidential determinations on emission planning and data. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the Waste Reduction Incentive Program. They have 2 years to create a transitional program to accurately collect data related to emissions. This year, on another level, we're going to transition from IPCC 4 to IPCC 5, but we're still using the 100-year metric. It's very important to note there is no anticipated plan to shift from the 100-year measurement of emissions to the 20-year. And for anybody who doesn't know what I'm referring to in the 20 versus 100-year metric, happy to explain that. It really has to do with the depreciation or the amortization of the emission from that material, whether they calculate it on the 20-year cycle or the 100-year. The 20-year cycle is much higher emissions factor than the 100-year. Additionally, the EPA has established that submitters will have to use verifiers. Now, I want to make a specific mention here that I'm not referring to EPA 608. I'm referring to the Clean Air Act. And it's really important to note that the EPA is trying to harmonize activity, information sharing, and databases relative to the Clean Air Act. Sorry, all the different programs that operate on the Clean Air Act. Stan, we're going to get to the question on, has the 2022 draft rule been published yet? We're going to get to that in a little bit. Good question. All right. Let's see, let me move that over there. And here we are. So the EPA has decided that they are not going to update EPA 608. This is a really important thing because when they updated EPA 608 in 2017, no service technicians were required to go back and get recertified. You were certified under EPA 608. They updated EPA 608. That update meant you were grandfathered in for your EPA licensing. So no need to go back to school, no need to go back to a classroom, no need to learn anything. This caused a lot of problems in the industry. It put the entire burden of communicating the change in EPA's regulations into the hands of the people that were responsible for the governance and policing without the authority for it. So wholesalers were expected to provide this information. Contractors were expected to learn it on their own without any additional training. The EPA did an awful job of communicating these changes. It was terrible. A lot of people shared this feedback with EPA, and EPA has decided to not use EPA 608 to update the AIM Act. They're going to be using a new numbered program. I don't know what that number is, but Stan, this is directly related to that, and we're expecting to see that later this summer. As a matter of fact, we were told sometime between September 21st and 24th. Now, adding this new program will require techs get new training and new certifications. This is probably the best news from a purely principled perspective, because it will mean that the techs will now be responsible for learning what the requirements are, and then they'll have to get certified for that. This is a game changer. So hopefully we skip all the mistakes that were made in the 2017 updates, where the techs didn't have to learn, as I mentioned before. It'll reduce mistakes. It'll rapidly improve the amount of time it takes to get these regulations into the market. But ultimately, it is going to require time and training. I don't think it's going to be a heavy lift, but we haven't seen those, and we don't expect to see them until the end of summer. But the end of summer is coming pretty quickly. One thing the EPA also indicated is that they're going to move beyond the 50-pound threshold. This quote on the right side is from an EPA official. I cannot attribute it to them, but this is specifically what they said, that they felt as though it was arbitrary. So Cindy Newberg backed it up. The EPA is not bound by the 50-pound requirement. I have a little poll I'm going to post. Let's see, where is it? Poll. Launch it. You guys can answer that poll as you want. I'm going to move this out of my way. Sorry for that. Okay. Oop, nope, that's not what I want. All right. So answer the poll. There's no requirement, but I'd really like to know how many of you are using the 50-pound trigger as your benchmark for reporting and record keeping. For those of you who are, this will be your biggest transition point, is a culture of going beyond the 50-pound boundary line. That's going to be a really big deal. All right, so far, Stan, I hope I answered your question. I'm going to hit answered live. All right, there we go. All right, so for those of you who are paying attention, the technology transition is firmly in place. You're going to need to upgrade your carbon literacy and also your awareness about what your allowable options are going into the future. I'm going to share two of those with you in a minute. Or really, I'm going to share one of them. I'll share some slides related to it. But 700 GWP for those of you in comfort cooling, and 150 or 300 GWP for those of you in grocery. I know grocery is heavily looking at CO2. I could have numerous survey questions on how you feel about the CO2 option. I think it's one of many alternatives that you can turn to in the future. But we still have a lot of work in the industry to do around training. But these are the numbers. These are published. Any questions about these as well? All right, you guys are making it too easy. We're moving pretty quick, so I'm going to keep going. All right. Now, another issue that we found that was important when we talked to people through the spring was related to the Circuit Court of Appeals reusable cylinder issue. The Circuit Court of Appeals update on the ruling validated EPA's authority. All right, so that's the first thing to know. Henderson, Pollard, and Walker did a really nice webinar about 5 weeks ago, and I thought they really nailed it. This quote, the second line here, comes actually from the ruling, from the dissenting, actually from the deciding judge. The HFC blends, this was an M&M comparison. One blue M&M in a bag of red M&Ms does not change the M&M integrity as it relates to regulated substances. And it's very important to note that the EPA, the dissenting judge under 7675, did believe that the EPA had the power to promulgate regulations as necessary to carry out the functions of the administrator, which was published in the AIM Act. This is from the AIM Act. And so the key takeaway here is that the EPA's authority to manage this was not jeopardized, but the way they went about doing it caused two of the three judges enough pause to roll back that authority for EPA. But it's important to note that the EPA still likely has authority to do something, and there are a couple of other reasons they might, specifically related to reclaim. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But this was a really interesting decision, and I find that when you read through these court cases and you have discussions with people around the industry, this is the solidification of EPA's boundary lines, whether they have enough authority or they don't have authority. This is where the judges really give EPA view. And I was impressed that, well, the case should have been decided a little bit earlier, I think everybody had hoped, but I was impressed that the EPA handled this really well, and so did the industry. I thought it was great. It really showed a lot of insight about what to expect in the future. It won't be the last lawsuit. All right. Essentially, what we want to pay attention to is probably the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the reduction in the phase-down schedule for refrigerants. So we're going to go from around 600 million pounds of refrigerant to around 360 million pounds of refrigerant. Now, the 2020, this all starts in a few months, but this 2024 reduction in access is combined with an added problem of spreading these molecules across a broader inventory of compounds. So some of the new refrigerants that we'll see are 454B, 466, 448, 449. So we have somewhere around 13 very popular blends. One grocer I talked to had been notified that they would no longer have access to R408 going forward. And they had this notification in March. So they were told, find alternative plans for your 448 needs. 408 needs, my apology. And I think that's, one of many stories we might start to hear, but it's an important note that materials like 404 and 410, if the expectation is to rely on the reclamation industry to provide a buffer for the shortage, the shortcoming, or the reduction, then everyone's going to need to do a better job of turning in their refrigerants. If we're at 2 or 3% right now, and that's really where we are, right between 2 and 3, even if we could double that number, it's never happened. And we're going to do a 3-part series or 2-part series on it over the next month on the trends in reclamation, what's been happening, where are the prices. Reclamation is a tough business. It's really hard. Take small cylinders, consolidate them. There are some amazing vendors out there who have invested millions, tens of millions of dollars in improving process, but they fall short on getting enough supply. So this impact number is significant, and we're all going to feel it over the next few months. CO2 basis. So how does it, a great question. I thought the allocation was on a CO2 basis. So how does it translate to the pounds on your chart? I did have to make a bunch of assumptions in order to get to the total pounds. That's why the pounds are external to this. But if it's not 360 million, it's not 400 million. It's lower than 400 million. The CO2 components, for instance, in R32 are lower than they are for R125. So as we see R32 increase, we may see lower demand for R125. So we may see that number go up. But right now, based on the spread that we had access to, it looks as though it's about 360 million pounds. So thanks for the question. That's great. Okay. GreenChill. Anybody on this call who's participating in GreenChill is aware that GreenChill is updating their profile for inclusion. So it's an interesting opportunity. This is a best-in-class group of grocers in the United States that have voluntarily decided to join this association that EPA hosts. If you're not a member, I highly advise you to participate. It's a great program. The concept is that you're going to be a best-in-class grocer, so they're going to start making changes to the profile, so how you can achieve your GreenChill numbers, how you get new guidelines on accountability and transparency. As the ultimate goal here is to align with EPA's vision of reducing emissions, and of course, I can't leave out protecting the ozone layer, but we're on to reducing emissions, the protection of ozone layer process. Most of the grocers have already gone through their conversions away from ODS towards a non-ODS material. This next phase will really be weighted to CO2 impact. And for anybody who's participating in the program, you know that EPA has been using the weighted average process for a number of years. It's been very successful. I think it's the 6th year, and incredibly valuable information so that you can track trends over time. So to that earlier question that somebody asked about, aren't emissions tied to CO2? You're exactly right. We use the profiles from grocers and some commercial buildings to create a refrigerant profile that we then use to benchmark against that number. But CO2 numbers that come through in those GreenChill programs are absolutely amazing. And just so you know, it doesn't cost anything. You have to make a couple of pledges, and the people that run it are really committed to creating a good community. And if you go to FMI, then you get to be part of the award program. GreenChill is a fantastic Friends of the EPA program. By the way, I don't get any commission for saying that. I just really believe it after all these years. Significant new alternative programs. SNAP 2023 shows that we have our final rule 25. We also have SNAP 26 pending, and we were told that there was a movement on SNAP 27. I don't know what SNAP 27 will be, but this is the most important segments of the Rule 25. And it should also be noted that although most of you are here for refrigerant discussions, your peers in other areas of the business around fire suppression and propellants, they're also impacted by this. So it's a very broad topic under SNAP, and it's very important under the SNAP ruling to have identified your appliance types in your inventory to know what your exposure is for the future. This is one of the biggest vulnerabilities we see in end user profiling. You know, we work with a lot of end users of a variety of different industries. And one of the challenges they have is when they turn over their inventories to share with us, they often struggle with knowing comfort cooling, which appliances comfort cooling, which appliances refrigeration, and even what material types and how many pounds are in there. So if you haven't done this already, start profiling your own data. It would be very helpful for the next phase of what we're going through. And when I talk about phase, I'm not talking about a planned phase that is anticipated, I'm talking about one that is actually happening and occurring right now. All right, we have another question here. As the phase down goes into effect, is complete system redesign going to be required with the shift to HFOs, CO2, and other natural refrigerants? There's a lot of discussions around this, and the answer, let's get to one part in a minute. We're only going to answer one little piece of your question related to 6335. We'll talk about that quickly. But for CO2 systems, absolutely, these are totally new animals. They're nothing like a traditional refrigeration system, other than the components being the same, but they're much higher pressure. You have to deal with new things like pressure relief valves and pipe scheduling, so whether you're dealing with Schedule 80, what your pressure relief valves are set at, where your valves are, how your valves leak, and also CO2 systems leak. So there's efforts to improve those results. And then natural refrigerants are also part of 6335, Brett. So we're going to dive into that right now. Make sure I answer your questions the best I can. I don't know all the details, but I'm sharing updates. So here we go. 6335, 2-40, et cetera, et cetera. These are the key elements to that. Carrier posted this years ago, but nothing's really changed. I have 6335 sitting right over here. And there's only one state that I know of that's already approved this, and that's Washington State. That was approved July 14th. I believe Washington fast-tracked it to accommodate their HFC refrigerant management program requirements. So I think that was brilliant. 6335 deals with the refrigerant types. This is a hard slide to read. Again, this is from Carrier from 2019, but it's still relevant. I did a little bit of updating to it. I did not drop in the Washington State change over here, but when I share the slide deck out with everybody, you'll get to share this yourself. And my thanks to Carrier for doing a nice job on it. But IEC 6335 is fully baked. It is ready to be voted on by the states as they update their mechanical codes. It's a very important part of our next set of choices that we can make in throughout the industry. There are things in here about handling and transport, as well as mobile appliances, refrigeration in trucks and trailers. So I don't know if anybody else owns it, but it's pretty lengthy, and I was just going to grab it and share it, but it's not the easiest thing to read. So these summaries are fantastic. And these things take 7 years to make their way through the cycle. So I think we're about 5 years in on this one. 2018 was when all this started. And we're looking like we're in a good place for other states to start adopting 6335. I see any questions? Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay. I mentioned carbon literacy. It's really refrigerant literacy. I use the word carbon literacy a lot because it's what most people call to ask questions around. But these regulations are bookends, okay? And bookend number one is EPA regulatory policy, all right? How do they control refrigerant access, supply, demand? They have a whole set of regulations related to that. They also have some reporting responsibilities. But broadly, the industry struggles to keep up with the self-governance related to record keeping. So mostly companies suffer from really bad record keeping. And at first it seems innocuous, as though it's harmless. But as we start to move into these other classes of refrigerants, it becomes more burdensome and more important that you're aware of what A1, A2, A3 materials you have installed throughout your system. Now, 6335 addresses the size of the charge, the allowable charge, the responsibility for managing that. You can try to subcontract that out to your service teams, but you have to be careful. For instance, we did see lots of dry ship units get delivered over the years. More aggressive states were more progressive about making sure that adequate refrigerants were chosen. I wouldn't say that was great. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a second, related to the the Inflation Reduction Act. But you have to have some idea about your flammability, and the only way to get that is to know the total charge and the type of material that you have installed. And in the tens and hundreds of thousands of assets that we review annually, very rarely do we get a complete inventory from anybody where we know the material type and the quantity. It's less than 7%. So as we broaden out and we start now to look at the scope of comfort cooling and the comfort cooling appliances under 25 pounds, we're starting to see a lot more vulnerability in people's data. So if you get nothing else other than today, There is a risk, an operational risk, because we have fewer pounds. You don't know your exposure. There are newer refrigerant blends coming in. You need to know what's allowable. But without knowing what your asset profile is, you'll never know your full exposure. And you've probably got plenty of vendors around you. Maybe you've got wholesale suppliers that you can reach out to and ask questions of. What did I buy? What's, is this all R410? Most of the comfort cooling is R410. So that's an easy one. Now you need to know how many pounds are in it. And was it field adjusted when it got installed? Refrigeration people have it much harder. They don't always know the refrigerant types. They're all over the place. We can make certain assumptions about vintages of equipment, but it's a real struggle when you don't even know when the piece of equipment was bought or installed. But you're going to want to learn about terms like lower flammability level or refrigerant concentration limits. I don't think you have to worry too much about things like minimum ignition energy, because most of these refrigerants aren't any more flammable than things you already own. But you do want to become familiar with it, because there is a density issue in a building of how many of these you can put next to each other or in a cubby. Oftentimes we see equipment that's recessed into a space. You have to be careful. Maybe that space isn't big enough to allow circulation of air in case there's a leak. Everything leaks. There isn't a leakless piece of equipment out there. So just keep that in mind. Safety often gets forgotten about, but it is really important. All right. Sharing this with you. This was part of a presentation I participated in regarding what is likely to be the next most important refrigerant to many of you on this call, and that is R454B. You'll see the reference to 6335. This is a residential ducted unit, and 454B is an A2L refrigerant. Going back a second, A2Ls are in here, lower flammability level right there. All right. And this all came out of the ASHRAE Safe Refrigerant Task Force. That was a great group, great results, absolutely top-notch work there. All right, so you want to know the difference between 454B and 410A, because this is the next one for you to pay attention to. Actually, my two slides are backwards, but it's fine. I'll share this one and I'll reverse them when I share them at the end. Temperature at -20, 27.5 PSI versus 31.7. And I gave you the variance over here. These are really close. And oil's the same. So theoretically, this should be a wonderful option for everybody who has existing equipment. And I think it's going to be a really important part of everybody's future. And I don't just feel that way. Trane, Carrier, York all feel the same way as well. I met with a group of Trane, York, Carrier service people a few weeks ago, and all of them have been given the same guidance. The retrofits from 410 will be to 454B. And now, comparison, so boiling point, super similar, -58.9, -61. Now, this is going to back to that person who talked earlier, asked the question earlier about, hey, I thought the CO2 or the emissions number was related to CO2. We try to reduce everything to familiar industry topics or terms, sorry. If R32 goes up in production because 125 goes down, let's say we don't need 410 anymore, so we start dropping our R125 demand, well, that's great news. We can produce more R32. That'll mean the industry can produce more 454B. But these trade-offs are very hard to manage because the EPA does not have eyes on all the installed capacity throughout the country. As a matter of fact, anybody who lives in New Jersey, Washington, or California and has to report their refrigerant emissions, you might want to know that the reason you're having to report your refrigerant emissions is not so that the state can track what you're doing, but it's so that the state can report to their population what their combination of CO2 emissions actually looks like, rather than estimating it. None of those programs were started as an internal policing structure. They were started because those states, like many others, but those states took a leadership role and they decided, we really want to know our emissions number. So we're going to have a registration process so we can measure it. EPA couldn't tell you how many pounds of each refrigerant are installed throughout the United States. And none of the businesses that we work with have that level of accuracy on day one. That's a journey towards maturity. But the good news is 454's GWP is 77% lower. So as you can imagine, more 32 can be produced compared to R125. All right. Inflation Reduction Act. I mentioned it at the beginning. The Inflation Reduction Act has a 2-year window on when they have responsibility for delivering on end-of-life options for many things, but refrigerants are in there. The weird derivative outcome from the Inflation Reduction Act is this heavy investment in heat pumps. So we're seeing a lot of heat pumps being installed. I mean, electrification in the Northeast is very important to help reduce the amount of natural gas consumed in homes. They want more electricity. They feel like they have better control over the profile of energy at that point. And as a result, we're pumping out heat pump units to be installed all over the Northeast. And actually, in many parts of the country, the rebates are the same everywhere, but the Northeast is really doubling down and very aggressive. So we have a dual responsibility of phasing out refrigerants and improving our energy profile across the grid, which is leading to a contrary outcome, which is technically 410A systems are obsolete when they get delivered, since they're only about 16 months out from final allowable sale. So it's going to be an interesting year and a half. Also, look, I can't say enough great things about what reclaimers do. And it's very important to note that EPA is investing money in trying to determine how to improve or help reclaimers and the industry improve the reclamation rates. California, for instance, has a mandate that a certain amount of reclaim must be present in new installs related to certain refrigerant types. Unfortunately, reclaim is a verb, it's not a noun. And there's lots of people that are trying to make changes to that, but it hasn't changed yet. What I mean by reclaim as a verb is there's a reclamation process. But when you're all done with the reclamation process and you reach the high quality standard of AHRI 700, it's 2014, when you reach that standard, it's then labeled as virgin. And the reason this is so important is the governance on this doesn't exist. So there's no body that's certifying the concentration of reclaim. So there's no one to say, I certify that this is 85% post-use refrigerant versus 85% virgin with 15% post-use reclaim. And anybody who wants to reach out to me on this topic, I'm constantly advocating for EPA and AHRI to adopt a new set of processes. They haven't yet. Makes me a bit anxious because we're talking a lot about using reclaim, but we don't have any way to identify it. I believe this is an inventory integrity issue for the industry for the next 10 to 15 years. So I think it's probably the most important issue right now facing us. We only recycle about 14 million, maybe 17 million pounds of refrigerant a year, sorry. I was discounting for mixed refrigerants and things that don't make it back into the market. But of those 17 odd million pounds, it wouldn't be a surprise to see the marketplace recognizing 30 million pounds. Where's the governance? How do we control that? What is the definition for an actual reclaimed material? We hope that AHRI can adopt something. They haven't yet. If anyone here is on the call from AHRI, be happy to have a deeper conversation. But one of the people that I was talking to, Helen, left and took another role, and Helen's was wonderful, very, very insightful, but it's a very important topic. So when you're sending gas back for clean and return, you have to know the right questions to ask your vendor who's cleaning and returning this to you. But make no mistake, this is not to discourage anyone from reclaiming. I think reclaiming is incredibly important. It's to make sure that we know what we're talking about when we talk about reclaiming. Additionally, we should note that there are emerging protocols around carbon credits. Yale has one out right now. I think it's pretty well done. Really smart group of people built that or developed that. I think we're going to see a lot more of those destruction protocols out there. This is a really important topic, and I know there's only one slide on it, but you'll hear me mention it very often. All right, next, EPA active investigations. I'm going to share a couple things with you here. I thought it'd be very important for you to know that EPA is watching. Now, EPA doesn't do this from a desk in Washington, D.C. They do it from the regions, and they do it usually, most recently, with their partner, the Department of Justice. The average case takes about 3 years. So if you don't hear about something, it doesn't mean it's not happening. We expect all of these cases to be published sometime in the next 120 days, certainly before the end of the year. Common characteristics of a DOJ active investigation start with the next-gen compliance profile. So they profile a NAICS code. They look through their geography, find the companies that are in that geography, send them a letter. I'll share a copy of that in a second. And ironically, a lot of these cases begin in the summer. I don't know why, but I think it has to do with when they end. They end in the fall. And I think the summer is kickoff time. It's beginning of a new campaign. So they send out letters, look for responses, and then they go through their cycle that, like I said, takes years. Key part of your response should be to respond within 90 days. Even if you don't have the greatest information, get your response back to EPA. Don't let it wait. 30 days, excuse me. In many cases, we've seen people that had no paper trail, but they sent the EPA everything. And it's not bad, share as much as you've got, but be careful about what you share, because oftentimes it's overlapping and misleading and can really represent you poorly. And it's not that the EPA is necessarily out to get people. The first communication is with the Department of Justice, who then organizes the data. There are plenty of people to do it. Then they send it to EPA for profiling and support. By the time that makes it back, you may think, wow, I haven't heard anything. This is great. It's been 90 days. But it doesn't mean that they're not working on it. And in every situation, we've seen very specific milestones along the journey towards the fine, violation, or issuance of non-compliance. This is a typical letter. We've seen them go out numerous times, and they're followed by about 7 or 8 pages of additional information requests. They can be incredibly overwhelming and technical, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, my team's got to have this, or my vendor will have it. You'll be surprised. When they issue these letters in August, your vendors are so busy, they don't have time to go gather all this data. Your urgency isn't their urgency. It'll take them 30, 60, 90 days to get information back. And we've seen it in the best companies, not because they're not intending to support you, but because they're busy doing other things, and this comes second. So, your clients, if you're a service provider, you have 30 days to respond. You should have the leak calculations on every single refrigerant addition. For the record, without some type of digital tool like Trakref, I have actually never seen the leak calculations on the service tickets. But remember, the DOJ's got a lot of resources. They analyze these things heavily. And if you've got 1 or 2 people working on it, they might have 4 or 5. And that means they are far faster at responding than you will be. And that can feel overwhelming when you get into phase 2. All right, I see one question. Are those leak calculations calendar year, EPA method 1 or 2? Oh, great question. Whatever you want to put on there, put on there. If you want to put on there your year-to-date numbers, put them on there. If you want to put your annualized rate, annualized scares me because it's a view of the future based on what you've got happening. So if you have a system that's constant chronic leaker, it's not going to look good. But the rolling pounds, which is method 2, that presents a little bit better narrative, when you're sharing leak calculations. But whatever leak rate you want to put on there, put on there. As long as you share a leak rate, don't submit records without the leak rate. If you're on this call and you're like, oh, we don't need software, we've got this all under control, or we've got a piece of software and it's working fine for us, ask yourself those questions. Can I see the leak rate? Did I meet my 90-day milestone leak inspection requirements for my conditional appliances? Do I know where all my assets went at the end of their life? And you start to work through all these conditions, and you start to feel the pressure of answering a DOJ letter. And I want to make a point. I intentionally chose two small investigations because I thought it would be helpful for you to know you don't have to be really big to be overwhelmed by this responsibility. And one of the companies suggested they possibly go out of business as a result of it. That's how anxious they felt about it. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that your responsibility to privately manage this is a bigger responsibility than if the EPA told you send this data in next month. Because when they come to get the data from you, the assumption is that you followed all of the rules, not you avoided them. And think of your company posture. Is my posture defensive? Is my company posture offensive, where I'm ready for anything? Most of the time, company postures are defense. And you really want to remember, if a defensive posture following the narrowest scope, you're likely running right up on those navigational responsibilities. So be very careful. All right, I got to go quickly through these next slides. California, Washington State, 4 R's: record keeping, reporting, registration, reclaim. Those are your 4 R's. Both states have them. Both states have responsibilities for refrigeration and comfort cooling. California's reporting responsibility for all except the South Coast Air Quality Management District is primarily for refrigeration. Although there is one section where you have to report your comfort cooling emissions numbers. So don't ignore comfort cooling in California just because you don't have to report the comfort cooling service events. Washington State, on the other hand, is totally different. That responsibility, which has not been fully baked yet, it is sitting out there in the public domain. If anyone needs access to it, I will help you find it. You can get to it and you can make comments before the end of August. The state of Washington has been an amazing regulatory group. They have sought input on everything. They listen. They host meetings. If they don't feel like they heard you well enough, they host second meetings. If they have follow-up, they'll host a third meeting. I have never seen a group of people more intent on getting it right than Washington State. Because anybody who had to file in New Jersey knows that New Jersey was a train wreck from a data perspective. It was awful. It was terrible. Not that they had bad intentions. They just wanted to keep it simple. But keeping it simple meant keeping it very messy, unfamiliar, and the data was very hard to get set up. And it's not digitally structured so that you can automate this. It is, I consider New Jersey to be the complete antithesis of what Washington State is. And so there'll be a reporting responsibility, reclamation responsibility, the state's listening to everything, to everybody who participates. These are the 4 R's. That's what you want to be thinking about. Additionally, Colorado does have a reporting responsibility, but it's based on tons of cooling. If anyone needs any deeper dive on that, just reach out to me. All right. If you weren't already overwhelmed by the environmental impacts of refrigerants, you should know that refrigerants are also a part of the class of family of chemicals called PFAS. PFAS are bad. They get into your water system. I live in a town where 2 out of our 3 wells were shut down because of PFAS. The Europeans are far ahead of the US in defining what PFAS and refrigerants are. The most aggressive state in the United States is Maine. They have a regulation on PFAS. We expect more states to follow that. We do not expect Maine, I did call them, we do not expect them to change that regulation until 2029. This is a really big topic. One slide's not going to do it, but I really wanted to point out that PFASs are very important. Okay, meat and potatoes of today's discussion related to non-EPA policy development regulations. All right, so there's the regulatory structure about what did you use, supply and demand. There is a new emerging, much more important, far greater, far more valuable issue referred to as non-financial reporting data, NFRD. Okay, the SEC is the US's version, that controls public disclosure of information for public companies. CSRD falls under a group called ESMO or EU. Yeah, ESMO, I think it is. If I got that wrong, my apologies. But ESMO is what has something called the CSRD that replaces the non-financial reporting disclosures, which have been in place since 2017. The intention here is to protect shareholders from false information. It is not the SEC's intention or their authority or their interest at all to tell somebody your emission numbers are too high. Instead, the SEC feels as though ESG reports have been abused because the data disclosed in ESG reports has not been accurate. And so they intend, and are going to enforce that anything that you publish that goes to shareholders is accurate. That is 100% of the SEC's intention. Now, refrigerants fall under Scope 1 emissions. And in many cases, they're the largest segment of Scope 1 emissions. And as a reference to that, there's a small grocer. There's two very interesting profiles here. We have Dollar General, who doesn't disclose their emission accurately for Scope 1. They have no plan to. So they're not lying. They're just not reporting it. Then they have a competitor, Dollar Tree, who does disclose ESG. Dollar Tree followed a profile that's provided by EPA and IPCC. And as a result, their refrigerant emissions were 55% of their Scope 1 emissions. It's a really big number. All right, so again, I'm sharing here FRAG, SEC, and also something you should add to your carbon literacy, which is the ISSB. ISSB is a group that is formed under the Sustainability Accounting Board, and it's very important because they're building the framework for what disclosures will look like. And that's right up here. So TCFD was formed in 2015 under the UN's protocol. It was a voluntary group, a task force on carbon financial disclosures. GRI has been a contributor for decades to this concept. Actually, GRI and a group called CIRRUS, heavily influential in the development of these policies. But as you can see, whether it's CDSB or SEC disclosures, all of these are evolving to be one standard. And a year ago, there were 9. Today, there's 3. We expect that to be pretty harmonized within the year. So not a lot of time to drill into that today, but a very important topic just the same. And you have to be asking yourself, how does this have any impact on what I'm doing? And it has nothing to do with your regulatory posture about defense or offense. This is a 100% reporting disclosure obligation. If you publish an ESG, that ESG will have to be accurate. I would also tell you, if you haven't already done it, look up the FTC's green guides. All right, this is a very simple explanation of CSRD. It's in the slide deck we'll share with you. No need to do it here. This is our version of the impact of each of these regulatory issues on the population of buildings in the United States. There are roughly 6 million buildings in the United States. 4 million are considered large, which is 25,000 square feet and larger. Now, it's very important to note that pretty much every building in the state of California is going to be part of California's ARB program. Even though you only have to report your 50-pound and larger refrigeration appliances, what you'll start to see as you go through this is the expansion of those people and affected populations of buildings based on the regulation. So we got some help on this report. It's not perfect, but it's very good. I would rely on it. And if you're asking yourself, why does refrigerant emissions even matter to my shareholders? Because you'd be surprised to find out that if you put a price of carbon per every ton of carbon release, so a pound of refrigerant, 1 ton of carbon, you might be surprised to find out that this then has a big financial burden on the company. Right? Climate pledges and commitments, Right now, there are 422 companies that cover 55 industries that have made a corporate pledge of net zero. This is a really big deal. You can't get to net zero without managing your refrigerant emissions. It's impossible. And the irony is, the more you improve your energy efficiency, which we've seen tons of companies do, narrow in, focus on energy efficiency, the larger your refrigerant emissions are as a portion of your profile. So it's very important to include it. Now, these guys, it's a very powerful, influential group. Earlier, I mentioned CSRD. I'm going to mention California has 2 bills that are going through the legislative process as we speak. Why does CSRD matter? CSRD, a European regulation, says that if you do X number of dollars of business and you have X number of assets in our country, then you're a large company, you're going to report this year. If you're a large public company, you're actually going to be reporting for this year. If you're a large private company, you're going to be reporting in 2 years. And as the years evolve, the size of the companies that are reporting goes down. You have to have a certain number of employees, but you'd be amazed at how quickly that number impacts businesses. So here in the US, the number we've seen is between 3,500 and 5,000 companies that are impacted by European reporting regulations. So if you're a US company and you have X number of dollars overseas, you're going to have to submit reports to the EU, even if you're not a filing in the EU on one of the EU boards. Same thing goes for California. It's very important. California has these 2 bills. This is the 3rd year that this group of bills has gone through. Each year they get a little bit better. Last year they failed because they missed a budgetary responsibility check mark. And so Governor Newsom is very aggressive with his budgetary outline. And so if this bill were to sway Newsom's budget projections, he would reject it. He has a treasurer that very thorough on this, and it did not pass the treasurer's check mark. So what happened is Senator Wiener went back to the drawing board, rewrote this, found new sponsors, brought them back this year. We've been tracking this as it goes through, again, 3rd year. These bills are much better thought out. So if they go through, any business that is $1 billion or more in revenue globally, but has activity in California, will have to report in California for all their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. Now, just for the purpose of today, we're just focusing on scope 1. This will be very important. So you could be, I just talked to a grocer the other day. They have 0 business in California, but they have ownership from a company that does business in California. And they found out that even though they're 14 states away from California, they will have to report. This was really big news to them. This is how the long arm of this reporting patchwork will impact refrigerants. All right. For those of you, I'm going to go quickly through this. I spend a lot of time on it outside of my regulatory review process. These are the new titles that we see spending time with us in our refrigerant profiling. Chief Compliance Officer, Sustainability Officer. Last year, we were at a name show. It was great, North American Environmental Managers. And they decided that EHS and S was the new title. EH and S was no longer good enough. We see carbon accountants that we're training. We see carbon analysts that we're bringing up to speed on what the carbon impact is. We're seeing all of the same disciplines in the non-financial world that we see in the financial world. So if there's a bookkeeper for a financial transaction, now there's going to be a bookkeeper for non-financial transactions. So they're going to be auditing these things. You say you put 30 pounds of refrigerant into that rooftop, prove it. I need to see the records from it. I want to see where you bought the material, when you bought it, how it was applied. It's going to be very specific. But we're starting to see students who are getting graduate degrees in carbon accounting. It's brand new degree. Marketing for climate and sustainability, it's a degree. We're getting tons of these people flooding into this industry to help solve these emission reporting responsibilities. I want to share them with you here. Okay, what are these teams going to do? These are the things on their list. The last slide. Look, emerging demands for all these different roles are changing the profile of refrigerants dramatically. And this idea of transparency is top of mind in every one of these discussions. Our time on our team is eaten up answering questions for people that are maybe improving their literacy or trying to understand how the process works. Not our process, but their own process. You know, how is it bought? How is it used? How is it recycled at the end of its life? Hey, look, 30 years and we still vented 12 billion pounds of refrigerant roughly. So I got to tell you, maybe it'll help. Like, I appreciate everybody spending time with us. It's been an hour. I'd hope to get this done sooner, but there's a lot here. I hope I kept everybody awake. We're going to be doing another blog in 2 weeks, just about, or I guess it's a week, on refrigerant reclaim pricing trends and end-of-life options. So it'll be a 2-part series, published part on the 16th and part on the 23rd. And I can't tell you guys how much I appreciate you all joining. And if anyone has anything to contribute, like, hey, Ted, I think you were wrong, or I think you missed it, my feelings are never going to be hurt. I've had 30 years of making mistakes, and I get out of bed every day, and I just try to do a little bit better the next day. So do not hesitate to email me or even say, Ted, wait a second, I got something for you. I think you forgot it. I just want to share the right amount of information so we can really solve the problem of refrigerant leaks. It bothers me that I've been doing this for 30 years and haven't been able to fix it yet. So again, thank you all very much. I appreciate it.